Church in Branford. We're just delighted to have you here today for this wonderful event of the 375th anniversary of the town of Branford and of this church. We've called the event, as you should know by now, Theocracy to Democracy. Thank you for coming and gracing our building. Please help yourself to the plentiful treats in the back of the room, and coffee will be ready just shortly. And now, Dr. David Colley will introduce our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you. I know we're as many people we should have charged. Our participants today include Scott Branford, who is a professor of law at Ohio Northern University, with which I am very familiar, having lived in Southwest Ohio for 25 years. It's easy to get to if you're in Southwest Ohio, the Kentucky border, you go north on I-75, and you come to Limo, you turn right. And you're right there in the village of it. He is an associated scholar at Brown University's Political Affairs Project. Linda Meyer is a law professor also at Quinnipiac University. And I believe she lives in the borough of Stony Creek. And one other thing I know for sure, she's an interested bird watcher. Professor?
Well, it's great to see so many people there. It's more than I thought. But we will be done in time for the Super Bowl. I promise you that. Well, first, happy anniversary. Or happy birthday. 375 years is a long time. I'd like to thank several people. Margot Hardenberg, who has been terrific about setting this up, staying in touch. I'd also like to thank Professor Linda Meyer for agreeing to join me today. Dr. Colley for, I guess, suggesting this, so thank you for that. And then finally, Reverend Personette, thank you for letting us do this. I've been asked to speak for about 30 minutes, 30. And I know people's time is valuable, so when I do these events, I stick to the time. If someone says 20, I do 20. If someone says 50, I do 50. I've been told 30, so I will do 30. And then Linda and the rest of you will have about 20 minutes. Linda for commentary if she wants to do that, or to pose questions, and then everyone else as well. And I'm told there's refreshments after that. I'm a law professor, as David pointed out. I'm a professor, so it's going to be kind of academic, because that's just the way I think, and that's the way I write. And it's going to be a lot about law, because that's where I specialize in. And one thing that I'm doing with my project, and I'll talk about that generally in a second, is I'm focusing laser-like on the law. There's been a lot written, obviously, about the history of Connecticut and colonial America generally. But it's usually about social history or political history or cultural events. But I focus on law, as you will see. The title of the talk is Theocracy to Democracy in Colonial Connecticut. And I gave this talk in the fall, or a version of it, at the University of Connecticut Law School when they hosted a conference on the bicentennial of the Connecticut Constitution of 1818. It was in that Constitution that Connecticut, in its Constitution, disestablished finally church and state. So what my talk is about is how Connecticut got to that point. The Connecticut Constitution of 1818 provided in pertinent part that, quote, the exercise and enjoyment of religious profession and worship without discrimination, shall forever be free to all persons in this state, and no preference shall be given by law in any Christian sect or mode of worship. The Connecticut Constitution of 1818 also omitted any requirement of universal taxation for the support of churches, which was a major departure from the practice in colonial Connecticut, as we will see. As I mentioned at UConn, I don't think it's possible to understand disestablishment in Connecticut without appreciating how the law addressed religion in colonial Connecticut. But before I get into the details of that, another piece of biographical information, if I could. I grew up in Storrs, Connecticut. And in academia, as Linda knows, you got to go where the jobs are. So that's why I'm in Ohio. But because I love New England so much, every chance I get, I come back. So I'm spending the year at Brown, as I've done before, and as I do in the summer. And I grew up an hour west of Brown in Storrs, so I go there quite a bit. And after this, I'm going to watch the Super Bowl at a buddy's house in Connecticut, in Mansfield. What I'm doing at Brown is I'm finishing a book tentatively entitled "To Bigotry, No Sanction, to Persecution, No Assistance," and then colon, academic books always have subtitles, "Law and Religion in Colonial America." I'm focusing on the 5 English American colonies that have religion in one form or another as an animating principle, to borrow Montesquieu's phrase. And those are Rhode Island, Connecticut, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. And I also explored the separate colonies that eventually were absorbed by these 5. And as I'm sure you know, Connecticut actually started out as New Haven and the River Colony, and then they joined. And Massachusetts was Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay and all of that. And the title of the book that I quoted, "Bigotry, No Sanction, to Persecution, No Assistance," is a quote from a letter that President George Washington wrote to a synagogue in Newport, emphasizing how important religious toleration is in the United States. Religious toleration was the animating principle of Rhode Island and Pennsylvania. Maryland was established as a refuge for Catholics, and I'm Catholic, so if we were back in the day, I would not be welcome here, I can tell you that. That's one thing I've learned. It wasn't good to be a Catholic or a Quaker in colonial, but it's okay now, apparently. So Maryland was established as a refuge for Catholics, and it tried to provide that by promising toleration for all Christian denominations. Massachusetts, and most importantly for you, Connecticut, were founded to create ideal Puritan colonies. But by the early 19th century, they embraced religious toleration as an ideal. And one final general point, this is about methodology. As I said, I'm a lawyer, and I also have a PhD in political science, so I bring that in also. And I explored the legal history of the particular English American colony I'm focused on, today, Connecticut, in order to better understand the colony's nomos about religion. And by nomos, I mean the laws and narrative traditions of the culture cannot be critically separated. All right, so here is the Connecticut part. As I mentioned, Montesquieu famously concluded in the spirit of the laws that each form of government has an animating principle, a set of, quote, human passions that set it in motion, close quote, and that each form can be corrupted if its animating principle is undermined. For the colony of Connecticut, the animating principle was Puritan Congregationalism. And so what I'm talking about today is the Connecticut chapter of my book. And part 1 of it chronicles how central Puritan Congregationalism was in the organic law, statutory law, and common law of the so-called river colony in which Connecticut was originally planted. Part 2 explores the law of New Haven colony, where we are, a separate community settled in 1638 that joined with the river colony in 1665 to create a unified Connecticut colony. Part 3 examines the law of the Connecticut colony and endeavors to discern when Connecticut's laws began to deviate from Puritan Congregationalism. And the final part concludes by assessing the events that led to the official demise in the Connecticut Constitution of 1818 of Puritan Congregationalism as the animating principle of Connecticut. So here are several key points to keep in mind. And I'm going to start with the river colony, since that was planted first. 1636 was when the river colony was planted as a Puritan theocracy. The central tenets of the Puritan faith to which the Connecticut colonists were committed were sola fide, which means by faith alone, sola scriptura, which means by scripture alone, the priesthood of all believers, which means God is equally accessible to all the faithful, and every Christian has equal potential to minister for God, and finally the sovereignty of God. Congregationalism was the ecclesiastical structure they established to effectuate their faith. Thomas Hooker, John Haynes, and Roger Ludlow are widely regarded as the founders of the river colony. These 3 men and a cadre of followers fled Massachusetts Bay Colony during a 2-year span in the mid-1630s with the aspiration of acquiring more land, and because of increasing concerns about the leadership of Massachusetts Bay and personal differences between Hooker and John Cotton, the preeminent minister and theologian in Massachusetts Bay at the time. Commonly referred to as the river colony because of its proximity to the Connecticut River, the initial Connecticut planters settled in the towns of Hartford, Wethersfield, and Windsor, and were governed by the so-called March Commission from March of 1637 into the enactments of the Fundamental Orders of 1639. The March Commission was a temporary measure designed to help resolve conflicting claims to the colony by Massachusetts Bay, the river colony planters who fled from Massachusetts Bay, and holders of a patent from the Earl of Warwick in England. The Fundamental Orders of 1639 have been called by many historians the world's first written constitution. They were designed to establish a civil government to preserve the congregational churches. There was no toleration of any religion except Puritanism. In a common phrase, the state was to be the, quote, nursing father of the church. Of course, those ideas were traceable to the Old Testament, specifically Isaiah 49:23, and had been embraced by numerous political philosophers and theologians throughout history. What was unique about the river colony's fundamental orders was the absence of any reference to an earthly authority. There were 11 fundamental orders, and each was dedicated to delineating the river colony's form of government. Roger Ludlow is widely credited as the draftsman of the document. Lest there be any doubt that the river colony was indeed a congregational commonwealth, the first order in the fundamental orders conferred upon the magistrates, quote, power to administer justice according to the laws here established, and for want thereof, according to the rule of the Word of God. The records for colonial Connecticut are both voluminous and readily accessible thanks to the people at UConn, really. They digitized it all, and you could sit at your house and read them if you wanted to. They demonstrate beyond any doubt that the early laws of the river colony endeavored to effectuate the colony's animating principle of Puritan Congregationalism. Even Tocqueville noticed it although he didn't understand why. He wrote as follows in Democracy in America, quote, "The legislation of Connecticut begin with the penal laws, and strange to say, they borrow their provisions from the text of the Holy Writ." I only have time to mention one example. The first penal laws codified in the River Colony were 12 capital laws that cite the Bible as legal authority. The government also required citizens to pay a tithe to support the established Puritan church. Subsequent legislation likewise used law to advance the animating principle of Puritan Congregationalism. For example, the statutory code averred that the primary purpose for school in the River Colony was to defeat Satan's plan of withholding knowledge of the Scriptures from the people by keeping them in an unknown tongue. Judicial decisions. And so what I do is I focus on the colonial constitutions, on the statutes, and then on the court decisions. So now I'm on the third. So judicial decisions likewise sought to effectuate the River Colony's animating principle. Magistrates were commissioned to do justice according to our laws and the rule of righteousness, and that's a quote. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the first order of the fundamental orders provided that they should, quote, "administer justice according to the laws here established, and for want thereof, according to the rule of the Word of God." I have a lengthy section in the chapter detailing how these directives were implemented by the judges. For example, the River Colony's courts sometimes resorted to biblical practice in cases involving theft by requiring a guilty party to restore double, triple, or quadruple the amount stolen, and the judges' decisions were replete with religious references. And now to New Haven. As you know, the New Haven Colony was planted in 1638 for the same reason as the River Colony, to create a Puritan theocracy. But as you might not know, the late Perry Miller, the most celebrated of the intellectual historians of American Puritanism, characterized New Haven as, quote, "the Bible Commonwealth and nothing else." In contrast to Massachusetts Bay, which Miller said, quote, "contained too many other elements besides Puritanism." Connecticut, i.e. the River Colony, which, quote, "grew up in too haphazard a fashion," and Plymouth, which he claimed was, quote, "too plebeian." The Connecticut chapter of my book includes a lengthy section on the New Haven Colony. New Haven, as you know, was founded by the Reverend John Davenport, and I always mispronounce the next name, so I apologize, Theophilus Eaton.
Got it.
Yes. And 500 English Puritans. They originally planned to settle in Massachusetts Bay, but quickly decided that the Bay Colony was not sufficiently strict in its religious observations. New Haven had 3 organic laws, or what I call colonial constitution, during its short life as a separate colony. The colony's commitment to Puritan Congregationalism was evident in all 3. For example, it was decreed therein that the leaders of the government were conferred, quote, "the power of making and repealing laws according to the Word," and everyone knows what the Word is. Law in the New Haven Colony sought to advance the colony's animating principle. The statutory code of 1656 certainly did, and before the code was enacted, the Word of God, the Bible, was invoked by the government of New Haven as a code of laws. 2 examples of the religiosity of New Haven's laws were that profaning the Sabbath, quote, "proudly, presumptuously, and with a high hand," was punishable by death, and the governor was required to swear an oath that he would govern, quote, "according to the fundamental order and agreement made for government thereof, and that you will carry and demean yourself for the said time of your government according to the laws of God and for the advancement of his gospel." That was the oath he had to take. Judicial decisions likewise endeavor to effectuate the animating principle, and I include a lengthy section in the chapter on the common law in the New Haven colony. Indeed, the judges themselves were selected in accordance with the criteria for fit rulers that God decreed to Moses. And New Haven was unique among the New England colonies in rejecting trial by jury because of the faith the settlers had in the wisdom and righteousness of the judges. Reverend Davenport declared that judges should decide cases, quote, according to God's appointment, and should, quote, consult with men of God in all hard cases and in matters of religion. Moreover, New Haven's criminal justice system had two objectives, both of which were intimately connected with the colony's animating principle of Puritan Congregationalism. One of the objectives was public censoring of public offenses so that the judges could glorify God by demonstrating the colony's commitment to his word, and the second was securing repentance by the defendant himself. The River Colony and the Connecticut Colony joined in 1665 to form a unified Connecticut colony. In 1660, the people of Connecticut received word that Cromwell's protectorate had come to an end and that the English monarchy had been restored. Connecticut's leaders, wishing to eliminate the uncertainties inherent in the Warwick Patent, sent John Winthrop, Jr., their popular and talented governor, to England to request a charter from the new King Charles II. The charter was conferred in 1662. The land granted to the Connecticut colony included the entire New Haven colony. At first, New Haven objected to being annexed by Connecticut. But in 1665, the two colonies were formally united after the leaders of New Haven decided it was better to be absorbed by Connecticut than by New York. A number of factors contributed to the New Haven colony's demise: the death of its strongest governor, Theocracy, economic troubles, winding up on the losing end of significant boundary disputes with neighboring colonies, and harboring several of the judges who had sentenced King Charles I to death, which was not well received by King Charles II. New Haven's formal act of submission to the River Colony was issued on January 5th, 1665, and it emphasized the animating principle of Puritan Congregationalism shared by the former separate colonies. And this is what it said. Yet so, brethren, in ye fellowship of ye gospel might come to a cordial and regular closure, and so to walk together in love and peace, to advance Christ, his interest among them, which is our design. From that day forward, New Haven became a part of the Connecticut colony and was subject to the laws of Connecticut, including the dictates of the 1662 Charter. The 1662 Charter superseded the fundamental orders of 1639, but the structure of government outlined in the Charter differed little from that in the fundamental orders. The colony's animating principle remained Puritan Congregationalism, which was decreed to be in the Charter, quote, the only and principal end of this plantation. Why would King Charles II, who was widely thought to be a closet Catholic until his conversion on his deathbed in 1686, grant a charter to a Puritan colony that did not embrace religious toleration? It is impossible to know for certain, but the most likely explanations are: one, John Winthrop Jr.'s tremendous skill as a diplomat, and two, the new king's desire to have Connecticut and Rhode Island, which received its charter in 1663, counterbalance the overbearing behavior of Massachusetts, whose charter Charles I had tried to cancel. In terms of law in the Connecticut colony, the unified one, I document in considerable detail and considerable length how both the statutory and common law in Connecticut between 1665 and 1776 gradually, and I underscore gradually, became more accommodationist to denominations other than the governmentally sanctioned Puritan one. It is not possible for me to do anything more than simply assert that in the time I have remaining and urge those who are interested to read that section, especially the discussions of the 1708 statute permitting, quote, soberly dissent, and of the judiciary's evolving approach to, quote, manslaughter. I also should mention that the so-called standing order, the unofficial alliance between congregational ministers and godly magistrates, fought it tooth and nail. One other source of law that I think you need to know about that I haven't said anything about yet, and that's what are called legalities. And legalities have been the subject of study of a number of historians of early American law in recent years. According to Christopher Tomlins, who's now at Berkeley Law School, quote, legalities are not produced in formal settings alone. They are social products generated in the course of virtually any repetitive practice of wide acceptance within a specific locale, called the result rule, custom, tradition, folkway, or pastime, popular belief, or protest. The colony of Connecticut had many legalities about its animating principle of Puritan Congregationalism. For example, in October of 1666, the General Court ordered a synod be convened to provide answers to a series of ecclesiastical questions that existed amongst the various plantations. The questions to be, quote, disputed were purely religious in nature and had nothing to do, from a modern perspective, with the running of a government. Moreover, after the synod was called, the General Court issued a decree for a day of thanksgiving to praise God for his blessings on the colony. From the first volume to the last, the public records of the colony of Connecticut are replete with decrees for both days of thanksgiving and of public repentance. The final section of the chapter, and what I'll close with, chronicles the years 1776 through 1818 and seeks to provide an explanation for why Connecticut finally abandoned the animating principle altogether. It's an explanation that emphasizes law more than previous studies have done. No, Christianity remained a constitutionally preferred religion until the Connecticut Constitution of 1965, if you can believe that. Although a statute had been enacted in 1843 recognizing the right to worship for those of the Jewish faith. Historians frequently disagree about the causes of particular seminal events. To mention but the most famous illustration concerning American history, they have been debating the origins of the American Revolution almost since the beginning. Whether it be the first generation of writers on the Revolution who insisted that the cry "no taxation without representation" was emblematic of the founders' commitment to principle, or the progressive school's socioeconomic interpretation of the event, or the Republican revisionism of Bernard Bailyn, Gordon Wood, and J.G.E. Pocock, or the myriad of competing interpretations before and since. There has been no shortage of theories as to what caused the war through which America's nation was born. Scholars of Connecticut's history are no exception to this rule, including with respect to the question of what led to the demise of Connecticut's animating principle of Puritan Congregationalism. Richard J. Purcell concluded that a simmering stew of religious, economic, and political ingredients led to it. Richard L. Bushman insisted that law and authority embodied in governing institutions gave way under the impact first of economic ambitions and later of the religious impulses of the Great Awakening. Unlike Purcell, who had emphasized the years 1775 through 1818 in explaining Connecticut's transformation from a theocracy to a democracy, Bushman dated the practical end of Connecticut's Puritan polity to the period 1690 through 1765, during which, he pithy phrased it, Connecticut Puritans became Yankees. Robert J. Taylor echoed Purcell's and Bushman's assessments about the role that economics played in the downfall of the animating principle. But he also appreciated that the, quote, very process of growth, the expansions of old towns and the settlement of new ones, the influx of peoples with different religious ideas and their spread in some sections all had great impact. And finally, I'll mention what Bob Inbolt of Albertus Magnus College said in the conclusion of his chapter about Connecticut for a new edited collection about this establishment in the United States in the early Republic. And Bob was on the panel with me at UConn, and so I quoted Bob to Bob, but he's not here to do that, but I'll still quote him. To understand this establishment in Connecticut, this is Bob, the desires for specific dates and specific actions must be put aside. This establishment was a complex process occurring for over a century. The Congregational monopoly ended in the late 1720s when Anglican, Quaker, and Baptist societies retained the authority to collect their own rates. The First Great Awakening and the explosion of sects compounded the difficulty of maintaining government control of religious life. For some, the exclusion of the Saybrook platform from the 1784 revision of the state's law was disestablishment, but not to Baptist and other dissenters, so long as the state mandated taxes for the support of churches and Congregationalism still enjoyed privileged social and political status. The 1818 Constitution is important as an embedded current practice in the state's fundamental law. Yet, long after ratification of the new Constitution, Protestant Christianity pervaded the laws and the civic life of the state. And that's what I'll end with now is my take on it. And you'll see how my emphasis on law answers the question about what led to the demise of Puritan Congregationalism as the animating principle of Connecticut. And this I'm just reading from the chapter. And so this is me quoting me at myself. Law is, of course, shaped by many factors, and the slow march to religious toleration in Connecticut is a testament to that fact. But law also shapes other concerns, be they economic, political, social, or religious. And no disquisition about Connecticut's colonial history would be complete without acknowledging how large a role the law itself played in the eventual disestablishment of Puritan Congregationalism in the Connecticut Constitution of 1818. It is true that the law of Connecticut only gradually became more tolerant of non-established denominations. For example, the 1708 law permitting sober dissent was unevenly applied and repealed at one point. But once the law sparked religious freedom's flame in colonial Connecticut, it could never be truly extinguished. So with that, I'll thank you for listening, and then I'll turn it over to Linda if she wants me to.
Thank you, Dr. Gerber. That was really such a rich article and such an interesting history, and I learned a lot from both reading and hearing it, so thank you very, very much. And thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks for having me as well. I hope you know that this wasn't a required class. I can't believe the numbers that have turned out, so thank you all very, very much. So one of the questions I had after reading this amazing article was, how did we get from there to here? And of course, as a constitutional law teacher, I'm like, well, where is the federal constitution in all of this? And don't we have an establishment clause? And what was going on there? And I don't know whether you had that same question, but I thought maybe I could answer that a little bit. So as you know, the First Amendment of the Constitution says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. How is it that Connecticut and Massachusetts and all these states still have established religions after the Constitution, right? Well, the short answer is that the Constitution says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. It doesn't say anything about the states. And I'll come back to that in a second. But the far more important passage in the Constitution for this purpose at the beginning was Article 6, Section 3, which reads, all executive and judicial officers, both of the U.S. and the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution, but no religious test shall be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. No religious test. That was a huge departure from prior practice. And it was very controversial. You know, when I read the Constitution as a law student, I'm like, yeah, of course, no religious test, that makes sense. But that was not at all obvious to the framers. And they had huge debates about whether there should be a religious test. Certainly in Connecticut, Massachusetts, you basically had to be a member of the Congregational church to be in government. And you had to pledge an oath to support God's word, as we just heard. So this is a big deal, and the framers argued about it. They were very worried that we would have people in government who didn't believe in hell. Because if you don't believe in hell, there's nothing to stop you from doing really bad things. So they substituted the oath of office because they believed that, at least at the time, an oath of office would guarantee that you would get someone who believed in at least some kind of divine retribution after death, and that would guarantee essentially that this person, even if they didn't subscribe to any particular religion, was still going to be faithful and ethical. And I think this was, this question of how much of the ethics in government and the morals in government is based on religion is a question that is always being raised whenever we talk about the Establishment Clause or the Free Exercise Clause. So I'm going to come back to that theme too. So why was it that the First Amendment was ever applied to the states if it only originally says Congress shall make no law? Well, it really took the Civil War. So after the Civil War, we passed the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. Well, that sounds like that would cover it, right? The privileges and immunities of the United States. So surely, after the Civil War, that's when the Establishment Clause started being applied to the states, right? Well, no. Because right after the Civil War, the U.S. Congress passed the civil rights laws that actually forbade discrimination and segregation. Private people could not discriminate, said the Civil Rights Acts. And the Supreme Court struck that legislation down. Struck it down and interpreted privileges and immunities of the citizens of the United States very narrowly, so that it did not mean that all of the Bill of Rights now had to be followed by the states. It merely meant that the states couldn't keep people from voting in federal elections, traveling interstate, and things like that. So, Jim Crow would never have happened if it weren't for the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court allowed Jim Crow to happen for all of that time. And there was no case law at all. There was no Supreme Court decision about the Establishment Clause. Not until 1940. All right. So what changed? Well, it kind of goes back to 1897. In Chicago, Chicago was involved in some public projects. They were doing some eminent domain work, and they wanted this easement that had been granted to the railroad, to the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. So they looked at, they got the railroad into court, and they had this nice proceeding, and the jury awarded the railroad $1 for their land. Well, no, it just says that the states can't take people's life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Right? That's due process. You got a hearing, the jury gave you $1. Well, the railroad was not happy about that. The railroad said, hey, this due process clause, that doesn't just mean that we're talking about a hearing. That also means that we're talking about actual fairness, substantive fairness. So that was the first case in which the court had decided that due process meant something more than just a hearing. And it started gradually grabbing some of the ideas and language from the Bill of Rights and incorporating them into that due process clause. And the Establishment Clause was one of those rights. So in 1940, and this happened in New Haven again, there were a couple of Jehovah's Witnesses, and they had a phonograph, and they had a bunch of books, and they were going through an Italian Catholic neighborhood near Longmore. I think it was Cassius Street. I think it was Acacia Street. Anyway, so they were going through this neighborhood, this Catholic neighborhood, and they were stopping people on the street, and they were playing this phonograph record of a lecture that basically said that Catholics were evil and terrible. So they almost got into a fight, and then they got arrested for violating an ordinance that said that they had to get a permit. And the permit was conditioned on whether or not what they were doing was religious. Well, they challenged that, and the court struck down that requirement, saying, "Ooh, we don't really like the idea of the courts deciding what's religious." That's new, right? So Cantwell versus Connecticut was that first case that applies that First Amendment. This was the Free Exercise Clause, but applies that First Amendment to the states. And then after that, shortly thereafter that, we get Anderson versus Board of Education, in which the court famously announces the wall of separation between church and state that we're now familiar with. And that case involved aid to families who were taking their kids to Catholic schools, and they were being reimbursed for their buses by the state. And the court upheld the law, but said, this is not establishment, this is not a violation because we're not actually aiding the schools directly, we're aiding families. So later on, of course, the court develops a much more vigorous jurisprudence that does start striking down a lot of the things that you all are familiar with, like school prayer and public displays of religious artifacts by the state, and becomes much more involved in this area of law and religion in terms of sort of separating law from religion. And I can go into that in more detail if you want to, but I don't think we need to do that. So let me just give the big picture here. I want to talk briefly about a couple of cases that I think are really interesting. Now, these are free exercise cases, not establishment cases. That means they're about the right to personal expression of religion. They also both involve Jehovah's Witnesses. The first one is Huntersville School District versus Providus. This was in 1940 as well. And what happened was the Jehovah's Witness kids went to school and they didn't want to pledge allegiance to the flag because Jehovah's Witness doctrine says that you can't, take an oath to the government. Governments are evil. And so the kids got kicked out of school, and they went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, pledging allegiance to the flag is super important. It's part of our secular expression of values and patriotism. It creates, it's a ritual of loyalty that we really care about, and that provides this kind of almost this community connection, right? This ethos of being one nation. And so the kids had to pledge allegiance to the flag. And then in 1943, in West Virginia versus Barnett, same kind of facts again about pledging allegiance, same Jehovah's Witnesses kinds of plaintiffs. This time the court reversed itself. In an opinion by Robert Jackson, who was prosecutor at Nuremberg, the court said, wait a second, we are really worried about becoming a kind of Nazi nation. We saw what happened when all of this kind of nationalism and patriotism got wound up, and we don't want, what makes us special as a nation is our protection for religion and our protection for individual difference, not our sense of trying to make everyone the same. And I think that those two decisions both articulate the same conflict that we still have. To what extent do we want government to be the kind of moral bully pulpit of the country? If it is the moral bully pulpit of the country, does that mean it's necessarily religious? Or is there another source of ethics that's not from religion? Or do we want a government that is just sort of neutral and doesn't take a position and doesn't have a kind of moral or specifically religious connection? So I think those issues are still very much with us in all kinds of conflicts that happen. So anyway, questions, thoughts?
I have a question for Mr. Grover. In terms of history in Connecticut, I'm curious, can you summarize briefly what the status of the franchise was, like say going back to the early 20s, and sort of what happened with that between then and leading up to 1800? Was there a big change there that might have been a contributing factor to all of this establishment?
You mean we could vote in election for governor?
I sort of recall that in Connecticut and Massachusetts, although they might have been different, but there were originally restrictions if you were not a member of the church.
Yeah, no, that's accurate. The way history plays out in so many ways, not just religious history, but also questions about equality and all that, we become more inclusive. And so, obviously, over time, more and more people were allowed to vote, untied to religion as it progressed, just like with voting generally. You don't have to be a landowning white guy anymore to vote, or even be president, as President Obama made clear. So one of the stories of America is how we're becoming more inclusive in so many different ways. Religion, of course, is one of them, and that's kind of why I was surprised to see it wasn't until 1965 when Connecticut decided that Christianity wasn't the only religion that deserved constitutional status. And that's, 1965, so, and of course we don't do that anymore. The U.S. Supreme Court wouldn't let us do that. I don't know why they let them do that. But anyway, yes?
I have a question. Insofar as the Establishment Clause is concerned, First Amendment, During the discourse on the First Amendment, is it not so that the founding fathers did not want to have a federal religion, one federal religion? That they know each of the colonies had its own church. We in Connecticut were staunchly congregational. Roger Sherman brings this up during the event. Virginia, Church of England, they did not want the imposition of a federal church on their state churches, their colonial church. Is that not a fact?
Absolutely. Although scholars disagree about how many of the founders has a view that you wanted the Establishment Clause at the federal level just so that Congress couldn't tell the states what religion they needed to be, but were protecting essentially the established churches of the states. There's scholars who think that that was their primary purpose. There's other scholars that think the founders had kind of more religious toleration ideas in place. And so, for example, in Everson, that 1947 Establishment Clause case, Justice Black goes back to Jefferson and Madison, who gave very big long speeches in Virginia, basically saying that Virginia should disestablish their established church. And it was this kind of rhetoric of the wall of separation and the concern about having government tell religion what to do and having religion tell government what to do. So there's a big dispute about to what extent the framers were only concerned about protecting the churches at the state level and to what extent they really cared more about toleration.
So in other words, they want to let our colony have its church. We don't want the imposition of a national church at home.
Right, and there's still one justice on the Supreme Court who thinks that should still be true. So there's one justice on the Supreme Court now that would let you guys get tax support from your local government.
I know that is. But the fact of the matter is that in the very beginning, they all acknowledge we're God-fearing people, and that there should be religion. And they didn't at the time. It wasn't until Angle versus Vitality in the schools, prayer decision, where it says freedom of religion, freedom from religion.
Well, actually, it's earlier in Everson they have. They
Well,
also,
Cantwell brought that out also.
yeah.
Just one thing. Gordon Wood, the great historian at Brown, he and I recently kind of have gone back and forth on this. Our conception of religious liberty is, as I sort of alluded to just generally in my answer to his question, is much broader than theirs was. What I'm describing is toleration in Connecticut, the movement to toleration. Toleration is different than tolerance.
Exactly.
And so I just finished the Pennsylvania chapter, and William Penn was committed to tolerance, not just to toleration. And Jefferson and Madison were committed to tolerance, not just toleration. So religious liberty means different things to different people in different periods. But as Linda pointed out, the Supreme Court now wants us to be tolerant, right? They want not just toleration, they want tolerance.
Bringing us back to the town of Branford and its 375th anniversary, it's rumored that in Branford in the 1660s that over half the population departed for Newark, New Jersey, with other people from southern Connecticut. And that seems to coincide with the merger of the River Colony and the Haven Colony. And the rumor that has not been brought up with is that the reason that people left Branford is because the Branford Ecclesiastical Society, which I think is running the town, there was a movement to allow people who were not members of the church to vote. Is that something is that consistent with what you've found, where there are theological differences between the two colonies, some allowed voting and some not, and that might have accounted for the migration?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know anything about the local history of Branford. This is the first time I've actually been here, so you're teaching me something on that. But it does make sense that people unhappy with change would sometimes leave and go somewhere else.
I was just going to say, it's my understanding, as a member of the Branford Historical Society and having done a lot of reading myself, that this is in fact true, what Jeff just alluded to, that in 1665, Branford, I guess because it was mostly settled by people from Wethersfield, we came under the jurisdiction of which is called the River Colonies, or Hartford, the Hartford government. And as of 1665, because of the decree by Charles II, Branford now fell under the jurisdiction of the New Haven community, which was much more rather, I don't know how to say it, strict in not allowing people who are not members of the Congregational Church to vote, that sort of thing. So it turned out that a minister from Long Island named Abraham Pearson had come to Branford. There was about half the town didn't want to be under this kind of jurisdiction, New Haven. And so they did, in fact, up and went down to establish Newark, New Jersey. And with some people from New Haven and Milford, but primarily from Branford. So people from Branford actually, were the founders of the town of Newark, New Jersey, and that was because of the religious difference between, the religious government of New Haven and the religious government in what you call the river colonies. It was very interesting part of Branford history.
We were the stricter ones. We left here to go to Newark because Hartford was too liberal. So we went down there to found a truly Puritan college.
What I hear is, let you correct me if I'm wrong, is that this long process that occurred in Connecticut democratized the colony state as religion as codified in the law and the Constitution was removed. It was a removal process, and what was left was a different atmosphere where democracy dominated rather than religion. Correct so far?
Well, I didn't actually assign the title to the top. And that phrase comes from someone else, one of the other scholars. So they're focused more on the politics of it, which democracy strikes me as a political word, rather than on the law part of it. But at the very end, when I was giving 3 or 4 examples of other historians say it was for this reason, one of them used that phrase. From a theocracy to a democracy. He's dead, so he can't be here. Otherwise, that was his phrase. So,
Okay, I won't hold you to it. Okay. Democracy is practiced by the law was enabled by the removal of the statutory requirements regarding religion.
sure.
But now we have come against another tendency in these United States, not religion, but race. And so now democracy is falling apart in the United States and in other countries around the issue of race. And so the law, curiously, it no longer has to define the dimensions of the issue. We have a new Jim Crow and so forth that's not codified in law. It comes to us in different directions. So the reason reason I raise this is because what I took from both of you is that it gives the impression that if you make these changes in the law, that this leads you to a democratic nation and the ability to have democracy. And I would submit that it's something much more subtle, that is lodged in the population and then is expressed by the government. I wonder which way.
Expressed in law. It's expressed in law. We're a government of laws, not of men. So these ideas that we're talking about, religious, for example, are codified in law. Right? And so Professor Meyer had mentioned Jefferson. And Jefferson wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which is probably the most famous religious liberty statute ever written in America. But Jefferson called William Penn the greatest lawgiver the world had ever seen, because he insisted that tolerance be memorialized in the law in the colony that he owned. So, law is enforceable, right? And so one of the things I say in my chapter is, Connecticut had a few laws that were liberalizing and more tolerant. Then they took them back, and the people didn't stand for it. And so they made them put it back in, or they amended them a little bit and said you didn't have to pay the tax if someone certified that you were a faithful member of the Baptist church or whatever. But the people certifying it were Congregationalists, and the Baptists didn't like that, things like that. And so they got rid of that also. And then eventually they got rid of the whole thing in 1818.
I was also hearing a little bit about what makes change isn't just the law, and that is totally true. You've got to have the hearts and minds as well.
Such an interesting overview. I'm new to this area, as you can hear. And I'm writing a book about Branford, and I wanted to incorporate facts and beliefs as well. I went to the library that gave me two little books. One was that it was one of advertisements, and the other one was one of the pieces. So now I have a mission. I want to write something that's worthy of that Branford. So afterwards, could me on where I go. Suggest the books that I can look at.
Sounds like walk over here and talk. Or turn around and talk. Or talk.
Yeah, there's a lot of things.
Quick question, in what modern town was the East Colony located? I didn't quite catch.
You mean Hartford?
The river colony, rather.
Right.
The river colony? Yeah.
Hartford, Weathersfield.
Yeah. Yeah, let me, Weathersfield, Hartford, and Windsor.
Oh, thank you.
I just wonder if a comment, one of my takes on the movement toward diversity in religious practices was an inherent democracy in Congregationalism, whereas we've seen here, originally there was lots of land, so people formed a church and then they formed a town thereafter by going off to Weathersfield, going to Branford, going to Newark with like-minded people. But when your theology is based on a democratic vote, eventually you wind up with a diversity of opinions rather than a viewpoint imposed from above, as in other churches. So, whereas you saw, for instance, Plymouth became Unitarian, where you throw out, almost the Trinity, by taking a vote on it, on your theology, and your comments about the inherent democracy and Congregationalism being a driving force toward toleration and diversity is land grab, I would really think. You don't have that.
No, I didn't know, we couldn't tell if that was a question or a comment.
Oh, it's a comment, but I don't have thoughts on it.
Yes. If you're Catholic, you do what the Pope tells you.
Right.
Life is easy. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to ask you fellow academic, when you pursue your study as the law, in my education, it was the philosophy that led to the law, the Enlightenment, for example, which had a great deal to do with a new perception of how religion should play in society. And I just wonder whether you take into account American reactions to European philosophy or American philosophy as being seeds of this movement toward toward secularization.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I was mentioning to Professor Otter before it was talked, came up forward, that I'm going to deal with that in the introduction to the book. You know, what was, that kind of thing.
The context.
Yeah, right.
Intellectual context.
Right. In Europe, for example, and all that. And then I just plowed through each of the colonies that were animated by religion in one form or another. And then the conclusion is going to be explaining how law can effectuate these changes. So it's going to be a little more jurisprudential at the end and at the beginning. But in dealing with each of the chapters, of course, the leaders of the colonies, some were very sophisticated, William Penn was, and others not so much. They just had sort of intuitions.
Or rejected the new idea.
Yeah.
They knew they
Right.
were sophisticated enough to understand them, but backward enough to reject them.
Right. Yeah. But very good point. Thank you. So makes me feel better about starting.
Do you think the isolated city-state, theocratic city-states like New Haven Colony, Hartford Colony, gave way to the United States, a more democratic union, because of their giving up of isolation and their having to give up some of their individuality to form a more perfect union, and that the God of the city-state, the theocracy, had to give way to the God of rationality? And do you think that that could be part of what happened during the times, the Enlightenment that happened during the 1700s?
Yeah, I have to think about that. In the colony that we're talking about today, New Haven had to join because they had no choice. The king gave territory to the river colony, and they resisted and decided, as we already discussed, that they're better off in Connecticut than in New York. And then in a similar way, there was some talk in Pennsylvania about trying to end the proprietorship that the Penns had. But then the decision was made that it's better just to let that alone because life is better under the Penns than under the Crown.
So they would have to join with the Huguenots in Maryland to fight the Crown, so they'd have to give up some of their own independence.
Yeah, they were in Pennsylvania. That some people, including Ben Franklin, wanted, or at least got the ball rolling on Pennsylvania becoming a royal colony. But again, they then decided, well, that's not such a good idea because life is better under the Penns than we think it would be under the
One way to think about theocracy and democracy is to think about who's administering the laws. And you spoke about the magistrates and what the source of their rulemaking was. But I don't think I heard about the process of selection of the magistrates and how that changed or evolved, especially after the constitutional provision that Linda referenced, where state office holders were bound by the federal requirement about not having a religious test and so forth. So I wonder if there were differences between the River Colony and the New Haven Colony, or evolution over those 100 years about how the magistrates were actually chosen and invested with authority.
Okay. My prior book is about that.
The price of one? Two books for the price of one?
Yeah, Oxford did it, and they really priced it out. It's like $100. It's crazy. But it's called The Distinct Judicial Power, again, colon, because it's an academic. The Origins of an Independent Judiciary, comma, 1606 through 1787. And so there, I go through each of all 13, rather than just 5, and talk about issues like that.
And what's the short version for Connecticut?
Well, Connecticut didn't have an independent judiciary for a long time, so it's a complicated story. One of the other things that the Connecticut Constitution of 1818 did was make the judiciary finally independent of the legislature in Connecticut. So that's what I'll say about that. It's complicated. As I said, in New Haven, they wanted the most godly people to be the magistrates, obviously. So I think they held firm on that for a good while.
And were they elected by the legislature, or were they chosen by some executive?
Yeah, it's been. I'm trying to remember specifically how it was in New Haven back then. They were chosen by the elite, and then eventually, in a variety of the colonies and states, they then were sometimes selected by the legislature, depends on the colony, sometimes by the governor, and all of that. It just varied. And the book came out, 8 years ago. So I can't remember exactly Connecticut, unfortunately, but I know I have some pages on it.
So just to give a national perspective on that, I think I was looking this up today, I thought it was very interesting. All but one president has been Protestant. We know which one that one is. And the Supreme Court justices were all Protestant until 1836, and that was Tawney, known for the Dred Scott decision. That may not have been a great moment for the Catholics. And then we didn't get Jewish folks on the Supreme Court until Brandeis in 1916. Now, of course, we have 6 Catholics and 3 Jewish justices, so we don't have any Protestants. The Congress was, we don't really know, we don't have the stats, but in 1961, it was 19% Catholic and the rest were Protestant. We have the first Muslim congressperson was 2007, the first Hindu congressperson was 2012, and the first Buddhist congressperson was 2013. So even though we don't have a religious test for office, we certainly have had mostly Protestants.
Okay.
Thank you all very, very, very much.
Well,
Main Street, almost got taken. So it was a big home run for Martha's hard work. Thank you very much.